tell the tale of the Hartley men in the year of 62. 'Twas on a Thursday morning in the first...
On the 8th of July 1832, during a period of rebellion in the Northumberland and Durham coalfields in the north of England, Cuthbert Skipsey, a striking miner, was shot dead, leaving behind a wife and 8 children. The youngest, Joseph, was only 3 months old. Yet despite having to enter the mines as a child himself, Joseph Skipsey would grow up to become a nationally renowned poet, respected by some of the greatest artists of his time. This is working class literature.
It was on a Thursday morning in the first month of the year, when there befell an event which well may rend your heart to hear.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Working Class Literature podcast. It's been a while since the last episode, so sorry about that. It's been a tough year in terms of work, kids, and an international health crisis. In this episode, we'll be discussing the life and work of poet and coal miner Joseph Skipsey. In many ways, Skipsey is emblematic not only of the brutal hardships faced by the Victorian working class, but also of how many often strove to lead creative lives despite those hardships, not to mention the beauty they created when they succeeded. I spoke to Chris Harrison and Dr Gordon Tait, who've both been doing lots of work around Joseph Skipsey. Unfortunately, there were some issues with Gordon's sound quality which couldn't be sorted out, so apologies in advance for that.
So I'm Chris Harrison. I'm a musician and music educator, and one of the projects that I've embarked upon recently over the last 10 years is to set some of Joseph Skipsey's poems to music as a way of reviving interest in him and reevaluating and getting a new perspective on his work. And the reason that I got involved with this in the first place is that Joseph Skipsey was my great-great-grandfather. So I'm descended from his eldest daughter.
My name's Gordon Tait. I recently finished a PhD in English literature at Hull University, where I was studying the life, work and letters of the poet Joseph Skipsey.
The song at the beginning of this episode was Chris's version of Skipsey's poem The Hartley Calamity. We'll be playing that as well as other songs by Chris based on Skipsey's poems later in the episode. And there'll also be a few more in the bonus episode for patrons. If you want to hear more of Chris's music, check out the links in the show notes.
So Joseph Skipsey was born in 1832 in the northeast of England in a place called Percy, Maine, which is on Tyneside, between Newcastle and Tynemouth. And it was very much a mining community. I think the most significant thing about his life, his father was actually killed during the miners' strike of 1832 when he was only a few months old, so he never actually knew his father. And it meant that the family was surviving without a main breadwinner. He had older brothers, but at the age of 7, he had to go down and start working. And so he started working underground at the age of 7. And the 1841 census, when he was 9, describes him as occupation coal miner. And that just, like, to me, it says it all. There doesn't seem to be anything unusual in somebody recording a 9-year-old as being occupied as a coal miner. In fact, he wasn't digging coal at that age, but he was opening and shutting trapdoors to let the coal trucks through.
And he entered the pit for the first time as a trapper boy, which involved him sitting in darkness for up to 16 hours a day, opening and closing a wooden door in absolute darkness. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, in his novel Sybil or the Two Nations, compared this role to solitary confinement, and he wrote, "Their labour indeed is not severe, for that would be impossible, but it is passed in darkness and in solitude. They endure that punishment which philosophical philanthropy is invented for the direst criminals, and which those criminals deem more terrible than the death for which it is substituted." While he was working in the absolute darkness, Skipsey managed to teach himself to read and write?
He taught himself basically to read and write, and I think nobody's quite sure exactly what process he went through, but he does talk about practicing writing while he was working underground by chalking things or writing it on the doors in the coal dust and practicing his writing. But certainly by the time he was a teenager, he could read and write pretty well. And he was able to tackle the Bible, obviously, but also Shakespeare and some of the major poets.
From teaching himself how to write against the light of donated candle ends, it was also within the mind that he developed into writing verses.
This is an interview he gave to the Pall Mall Gazette in 1889. And the interviewer said to him, "How was your love of poetry awakened?" And he says, "In those days," this is when he's a boy, man, probably around about teenager. "In those days, I didn't know that there was such a thing as poetry. But the elder boys in the pit, the putter lads as they were called, had a habit of ballad singing. It was seldom that they knew a ballad all through, but they used to sing snatches of ballads and songs at their work, and these fastened themselves in my memory. Their incompleteness dissatisfied me. I wanted them all, and as I could not obtain them, I used to fill them out here and there, and piece the fragments together, and so give them a completeness of my own. This patching of old ballads was my first effort at verse making." And then the interviewer says, "And what was the next step?" And he said, "Well, the next step was the composition of new words to the old tunes. I do not doubt at this day that the lilt of the old ballads has given me a tone to whatever music my verse may be supposed to possess." So that's quite a clear route in, that he's heard ballads and songs being sung, and the people who are singing them didn't know them all the way through, and he's realized that he can fashion them into complete stories, and then that he doesn't have to actually use the old words as a basis for what he does. He can make up completely new ballads. And the connection between poetry and music is very clear all the way through his writing.
This musical influence can be seen in the titles of his published collections of poetry, such as Carols, Songs and Ballads, a book of miscellaneous lyrics, and Carols from the Coalfields. But Skipsey's poetry would also be informed by the wide breadth of his reading, which was incredible by any standards, but even more so given the many obstacles in his way.
So Skipsey's poetry is informed by his reading. It's informed by Paradise Lost. It's informed by Shakespeare. It's informed by even Wordsworth, the great canon of English literature. But in these references that he uses, these are often outdated in a way. He doesn't have access to the absolute contemporary high culture, and as a result, his writing can seem a little archaic. The critic Jonathan Rose describes this as a cultural lag, where working class artists and writers only had access to cultural artifacts that were deemed out of date, that were deemed unfashionable. A working class writer may only have access to a volume of poetry or a volume of criticism even, that may be 50, 60 years old, because it's become sufficiently cheap.
One poet who readers often compared Skipsey to, or who they claimed he was influenced by, was the canonical romantic poet William Blake. Oscar Wilde, for example, said Blake and Skipsey shared a metrical affinity and a marvellous power for making simple things seem strange to us and strange things seem simple. In our bonus episode, we go into a little bit more detail about the similarities between Blake and Skipsey, as well as their shared relationship to John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. Arguably Skipsey's most famous poem, however, is The Hartley Calamity, inspired by the shocking events of the Hartley Colliery disaster of 1862.
The Hartley Calamity, referred to in the poem and the song, took place in January 1862. There had been a new beam installed to work the the mechanism that brought the miners up and down the mine shaft to and from work. And that cast iron beam snapped and fell into the shaft and blocked it at a time when there were 200 miners underground.
This resulted in hundreds of tons of debris falling into the pit and blocking the shaft. This pit had only one shaft, so there was only one way for the men to escape. That there was only one shaft had been recognised as a danger for centuries, but because it was economically more expensive to sink a second shaft, the common practice was to sink just one.
It was an event which caused shockwaves throughout the region and actually throughout the country, because it was the biggest loss of life at the time. And of course it was avoidable because, and this is it's a health and safety issue. There was only one way in and out of the mine, only one shaft, and when that was blocked, the miners were just trapped. The reason there wasn't a second shaft was because the people who owned the mines wanted to maximize their profits and didn't want to put some of the profits into providing an alternative. The miners weren't crushed by falling rock or anything, they just suffocated to death, and by the time the rescue parties could get down to them, they had died. Obviously there was foul air and gas and everything down there which contributed. Skipsey used to recite this at events which were held, sort of benefit events to help raise money for the bereaved families, and descriptions of how he recited it. It was obviously a very powerful recitation. This is Spence Hodgson writing about Skipsey, saying, when on rare occasions he recited the Hartley Pit calamity to a large audience, the emotion it awakened was almost painful to witness. I think I've never known a reader, reciter or actor who could be compared with him for his power over words. That's Spence Watson, Skipsey's friend, writing about him.
In a moment we're going to listen to Chris's reworking of Skipsey's poem. In it we see the sweat and dirt of mining work interrupted suddenly by the shock of disaster. As mentioned before, the 200 men and boys, some of them as young as 10, suffocated to death, and Skipsey, who himself had worked the mines as both an adult and a child, ends his poem recording how sons died alongside their fathers, with lines like, "Sleep, my son, close by I'll stay, and a watch over thee I'll keep. To stay awake the father strives, but he knows he too must sleep." As Chris explains, the vividness of the poem is no doubt the result of Skipsey's own experiences down the mines himself.
One of the differences between Skipsey's poem and other mining disaster poems, of which there are quite a number, that he actually tells the story from the inside. And he does that, of course, because he was a miner, and so he imagines how they felt while they were trapped underground, and that's what makes it such a harrowing story. That they start off they're shocked, and then they're full of hope and determination, and they start hacking away and digging away, and at one point they think they might hear noise outside and that the people are going to get through, and then it goes to despair because there's a second not explosion but a second fall of some sort, and then they start again and off they go, and then can't get anywhere, and eventually it's like resignation and despair, and they just have to give up. And I mean the scenes where they know they're going to have to, as they call it, they're not going to be able to stay awake, and they just pass the responsibility on to other people near them. It's just it's harrowing.
The Hartley men are noble, and you'll hear a tale of woe. I'll tell the tale of the Hartley men in the year of 62. 'Twas on a Thursday morning in the first month of the year, when there befell an event which well may rend your heart to hear. Before the day when most folk lay still sleeping in their beds, the Hartley men are up and off to earn their daily bread. On they toil, in heat they broil, and streams of sweat soon glue the stour to their skins, till they are black as the coal they hew. And back and forth the putters go, the wagons to and fro, and clang of wheel on hoof, ringing the mine below. The din and strife of human life awake in board and wall, when suddenly they feel a shock and terror grips them all. Each bosom thuds as each is duds, he snatches and away. Towards the distant shaft he flees with all the speed he may. They flee by two, by three, towards the shaft and seek an answer in each other's face for what they dare not speak. Are we entombed, they seem to ask, for the shaft is blocked and no escape have we to God's bright day from out the night below. So stand in pain the Hartley men, and swiftly o'er them comes fond thoughts of their families and memories of their homes. Despair at length renews their strength, for they the shaft must clear, and soon the sound of mal and pick drowns out the voice of fear. And hark to the blow of the mal below, do sounds above reply. Hurrah, hurrah for the Hartley men, for now their rescue's nigh. But even as for their escape, the men to hope did dare. A further rumble shakes the mind and drives them to despair. Yet as they kneel again, they feel their strength renewed again. The ring and swing of the mal attest the might of the Hartley men. And hark to the blow of the mal below, do sounds above reply. Hurrah, hurrah for the Hartley men, for now their rescue's nigh. But the beam that collapsed has blocked the shaft, there's nowhere left to crawl. And one by one the lights go out, and darkness covers all. Dear Father, till the shaft is cleared, close beside me keep. My strength is gone, my eyes are tired, I know that I must sleep. Oh, sleep, my son, close by I'll stay, and a watch o'er thee I'll keep. To stay awake, the father strives, but he knows he too must sleep. Dear brother, till the shaft is cleared, close beside us keep. My strength is gone, my eyes are tired, I know that I must sleep. Sleep, brother, sleep, close by I'll stay, and a watch o'er thee I'll keep. To stay awake, the brother strives, but he knows he too will sleep. for down below the Hartley men prepared to meet their fate, while up above by the black pit heap people could only wait. And fathers, brothers, sisters, mothers, the lover and the new-made bride, a vigil kept for those who slept from eve to morning tide. Yet still they sleep in silence dread, 200 old and young, to awake when heaven and earth have sped, and the final trumpet rung.
Events such as the Hartley calamity, in which 204 men were killed, were thankfully rare in the mining industry. The Hartley calamity itself remains England's most devastating mining accident. What was more prevalent amongst the mining communities was the staggering level of accidents that claimed lives in ones or twos, or made men economically inactive through injury for periods of time, or perhaps even permanently. One commentator described this phenomenon as being a colliery disaster in instalments. The statistics surrounding injuries and deaths that occurred in Britain's coal mines are staggering. One historian has pointed out that between 1868 and 1919, a miner was killed every 6 hours. Another was seriously injured every 2 hours. Another injured badly enough to need a week off work every 2 or 3 minutes. But when you see staggering statistics like that, or when you read staggering statistics like that, it's easy to see why miners would often be considered as hard drinking, as living for the moment, because they might actually never see tomorrow. You know, if they go to work, they may not come home again. There's a song by another coal miner poet from the northeast called Tommy Armstrong, who wrote the poem The Trimding Grange Explosion shortly after an explosion at Trimding Grange colliery, where the opening lines read, "Let us not think of tomorrow, lest we disappointed be. All our joys may turn to sorrow, as we all may daily see."
Despite all this, Skipsey's poetry, aside from occasional exceptions such as Downfall of Mammon and Reign of Gold, tended to stay away from overtly political subjects, as Gordon here explains.
Many mining communities only existed for the fact that they rose up around the mine itself. So in a way, it's very, very difficult for individual miners, to actually criticise the mining industry, because in doing so, they're putting their livelihood at risk. And many of the early mine worker leaders, union leaders in the northeast, people like Thomas Hepburn, for example, once strikes were finished with, they were made examples of. They were refused work, they were isolated from communities, and Thomas Hepburn became a travelling salesman in the end. As a result, somebody like Joseph Skipsey, it's very difficult for him to criticise the exploitation of people within the mining industry. But this difficulty wasn't just a personal perspective, a personal attitude. It was also an attitude that was fostered through his own poetry writing. In some of his early reviews, Skipsey's reviewers, which was the only real access that he had to a literary community to be able to improve his poetry. He wasn't surrounded by a literary network. He was pretty much working in isolation. And in early reviews, some of the reviewers dissuaded him from writing on more political subjects. And this seems to have affected Skipsey's writing in later life. The overtly political is removed from Skipsey's poetry.
You know, there are a lot of other contemporaries of his that were pitmen or working class poets And there was Geordie Ridley, who wrote The Bladen Races. There's Joe Wilson, who wrote Keep Your Feet Still, Geordie Hinney. There's Tommy Armstrong, who was born a little bit later and lived in Durham, or County Durham, who wrote a lot of ballads about strikes and pit life and whatever. And Skipsey's he's not so much one of them in a way. He doesn't. He's more concerned with creating something that he thinks of as poetic, and sometimes I suppose that dulls the message. Although I'm not sure that he would see it like that, and I'm not sure. But certainly he's more concerned to be a poet than a chronicler of working class life. Although he was very often referred to as the pitman poet or the pitman poet of Percy Main, which trips nicely off the tongue. Actually, he just wanted people to say, "Look, you're a poet," and that's it.
As such, Skipsey's poetry covered a range of themes as well as those related to mining.
Yeah, there's quite a lot about domestic life and sort of courtship and relationships between men and women and young men and young women. There's a section of the poems which are sort of spiritual, I suppose. He often refers to them as psychic poems. He doesn't deal a lot directly with mining life, and with actual life down the mines. So the Hartley Calamity, that is the one poem which really talks about disaster down the mine. Although there's another one called Bereaved, which relates to people losing their lives underground. And there's one, there's a few. There's a select few. Get Up, which is a great poem, which just is reminds people of the ever-present danger of working down the mine, and the fact that people who worked underground were always aware of it.
As has often been said, the personal is indeed very much political. As such, distinctly social themes come through even in Skipsey's personal poems about miners' domestic lives. The poem Get Up, just mentioned by Chris, and which we'll listen to now, is one such example.
Get up, the caller cries, get up, and in the dead of night, to win the bends their bite and sup, I rise a weary wight. My flannel donned, thrice sore I kiss the bends, and then with a sigh I close the door. I may not open again.
In these two stanzas, Skipsey depicts a powerful scene. His miner is awoken by the caller whose job it was to go round the village waking miners for their shift. The miner gets dressed, kisses his children, and leaves for work. But as he does so, Skipsey closes the poem with the thought that he may never return to see the family for whom he goes to work. Given what Gordon said earlier about a miner dying at work every 6 hours in Britain around this period, the social significance of this highly personal scene is obvious. Get Up is also the first in a series of poems which, though never intended as a coherent sequence, Gordon explained that they could be read together as recreating the miner's day. Unfortunately, we lost this bit because of audio issues, so I'll do my best to capture it here. Basically, after Get Up, the sequence moves through another 4 poems. The Stars Are Twinkling, A Golden Lot, Willie to Ginny, and Oh Sleep. So after the miner gets up, in The Stars Are Twinkling we follow him as he looks at the stars during his journey from home to the pit.
The stars are twinkling in the sky, as to the pit I go. I think not of the sheen on high, but of the gloom below. No rest, no peace, but toil and strife do there the soul enthrall, and turn the precious cup of life into a cup of gall. The stars are twinkling in the sky, as to the pit I go. I think not of the sheen on high, but of the gloom below. No rest, no peace, but toil and strife do there the soul enthrall, and turn the precious cup of life into a cup of gold.
Next is a golden lot. Here the gloom below returns as the gloom of the deep, deep mine. But rather than vivid descriptions of mining labour itself, Skipsey describes how music and poetry allow him to escape, psychologically at least, from the grind of manual labour. As the reality of work dieth away, his lot is transformed from gloom into gold.
And a golden lot is mine, away from the deep, deep mine, and the din of the factory is far, far away, and a golden lot is mine.
Next, in Willie to Ginny, Skipsey depicts a miner's safe return home, closing the poem with his wife's perspective that nothing dark could Ginny see a-coming from the colliery. Yet even here the threat of tragedy is ever present. Willie's return home is shot through with the relief of seeing nothing dark, that is, news of injury or death, returning from the mine. The flip side of this, obviously, is the daily fear of seeing something dark, a possibility which actually forms the basis of A Fatal Errand, another of Skipsey's poems, in which news is delivered of a death down the mine.
Nothing dark could Ginny see a-coming from the colliery.
Finally, in O Sleep, we see a mother rocking her baby.
Oh, sleep, my little baby, thou wilt wake thy father with thy cries, and he into the pit must go before the sun begins to rise. Oh, sleep, my little baby.
Rest, then, is brief, precarious, and ultimately interrupted by the mine itself. And in its mention of going to the pit before the sun begins to rise, O Sleep links itself to the dead of night mentioned in Get Up. And so, like the miner's day itself, the sequence begins all over again. In these poems, then, work is figured as a constant antagonistic and even threatening presence throughout the miner's daily life, from the moment they get out of bed until they go back to sleep. Despite Skipsey's avoidance of overtly political matters, the fact that his poetry's personal scenes open up such clearly social themes show that no neat separation between the two is really possible. Skipsey would likely have remained a purely local poet had it not been for his association with a group of artists called the Pre-Raphaelites. But Skipsey's connection to the Pre-Raphaelites was only made possible by the efforts of a Sunderland court carter called Thomas Dixon.
So Thomas Dixon was he was something of a pest to a number of people. He was a cork cutter in Sunderland, in the northeast of England. and he utilised the changes in the postal service to write to anybody and everybody he felt he had any kind of affinity with. Thomas Dixon crossed class boundaries with impunity. He didn't seem to care. The stature of the individual he was writing to, he just wanted a shared interest. That was enough for him to be able to write to anyone. He had far-ranging interests from politics to art, and communicated with such people as John Ruskin, the famous art critic, and even got the offer of painting lessons from John Everett Millais, the famous Pre-Raphaelite painter. As a result of this letter writing, he became notorious, really. He was in communication with people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and persisted in communication with these people, often even if they didn't want it.
The poet Robert Browning was one such person who didn't appreciate this kind of cross-class correspondence. In a letter to his friend and fellow writer William Rossetti, Browning wrote, "From time to time I receive letters from Thomas Dixon, 57 Nile Street, Sunderland, who chooses to write them and embarrass me. He sends books as presents, thinking there is a lack of that commodity in London apparently. I am in no condition to guess whether he knows you or does not, whether you will be pleased with his loan or bothered, as I own myself to be. I pass on the thing to you. What you will do in turn I shall not concern myself with, only, I entreat, do not return them to me." Aside from his assistance to Skipsey at a crucial time in his career, Thomas Dixon led a very active life. He campaigned for safety in the shipping industry, developed cultural institutions in his native Sunderland, and is credited with introducing the work of legendary American poet Walt Whitman to the United Kingdom. We talk a little bit more about Thomas Dixon in the bonus episode, available now for patrons. It was through Dixon that Skipsey made his connection to the Pre-Raphaelites.
So the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as they were initially known, was a group of artists working in the mid-19th century who sought to change the conventions of Victorian art by having an absolute dedication to an absolute accuracy in their representation. The three main artists of the group were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. These three artists were something of the bad boys of Victorian art, Dante Gabriel Rossetti in particular, and they changed Victorian painting quite significantly. Thomas Dixon introduced Skipsey's poetry to this circle. He sent copies of Skipsey's 1878 book, Miscellaneous Lyrics, to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti was particularly complimentary about Skipsey's poems, and in one letter described Skipsey's poem Get Up as equal to anything in the language for direct and quiet pathetic force. The introduction to Rossetti would have a profound impact on Skipsey's career. Prior to being introduced to Rossetti, he was limited to that of a local poet who had had some national reviews. After the introduction to Rossetti, Skipsey was exposed to a literary circle that was beyond what he could have imagined, and the influence of Rossetti and his group of friends and fellow artists was unreal for a working man.
Skipsey's association with the Pre-Raphaelites would be life-changing.
Following his introduction to Rossetti, Skipsey's career moved to a different level. He became someone who was known nationally. He was reviewed in publications such as the Athenaeum, which was an influential art and literature paper at the end of the 19th century, and he was always received positively. And it is this access to an extended literary network that enabled Skipsey to develop as a poet, to gain a wider readership, to gain a more influential readership. And it is largely for his connections to Rossetti that Skipsey is remembered today. Without that connection to this literary elite, it seems in all likelihood that Skipsey would have fallen into obscurity like so many other working class writers, poets and artists. Within 2 years of having met Rossetti, Skipsey had left mining completely.
Once he became known as a poet, people tried to persuade him to find work that was less onerous, work where he might have a bit more time to write poetry. He got a job as an under-storekeeper in the ironworks in Gateshead, and he was there for about 4 years. But that, actually what happened was one of his children was killed in an accident there, and he found it too sad a place to stay, so that he went back to mining and remained there until the 1880s. There were times when people again tried to offer him other work. He became under librarian at the Newcastle Literary and Philosophical Society for a while, but it didn't pay very much. And I think the story seems to be that he was so interested in all the books there, you can imagine it would be paradise for him, that he didn't like serving the customers or doing the menial work around the place. So in 1882, I think, yes, at the age of 50, he got a job as a schoolkeeper, we'd call it now, in Newcastle. And that was so he actually left mining at the age of 50, but we have to remember that at the age of 50, he'd already been working in coal mines for 43 years. So he became a schoolkeeper, and that probably was good for him in the sense that in the 1880s he was more active. He published some volumes of poetry, and he was asked to edit collections of other poets for a sort of an edition which was the purpose of it was to make poetry accessible to less well-off people. So they were sort of editions that you could buy relatively cheaply. And he edited volumes by Coleridge and Shelley and Burns and Blake and Poe. So, and those obviously are important poets, and he knew their work pretty well. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to do that. And then the most extraordinary thing, I think, was that when the schoolkeeping work became a bit much for him and his wife, they were recommended for the job of curators of the Shakespeare Birthplace Museum in Stratford-on-Avon. And it is an extraordinary episode. He got many, many letters of commendation from, and the list of recommendations reads like sort of who's who of Victorian literature and the arts.
Indeed, some of the famous names to send recommendations on Skipsey's behalf were Oscar Wilde, William Morris, Bram Stoker, Alfred Tennyson, and Robert Browning, not to mention many others.
And he got the job, and they went down to Stratford, and he stayed there for about 2 years, between 1890 and 1892. In the end, he became a bit disillusioned about the nature of the work. I think he'd thought he would be able to have learned conversations with visitors about fine points of Shakespeare's writing, and it didn't quite work out like that, being more of a tourist guide, let's say. So in the end, in 1892, he resigned and came back up to the northeast. He actually, I don't know if he'd lived completely on his own means, but he did have an independent income by that time from the government. His work was recognised, and he got a small annuity. So he lived another 10 years in a sort of retirement. Another thing which I think we should mention, it's sadly not probably untypical in Victorian life, is that 5 of his 8 children died before they reached adulthood. And that was in the 1860s. One of them, as I mentioned, was killed in an accident at the ironworks. And 3 of them died in a scarlet fever epidemic. So at one time, having had 6 children, at the end of the 1860s, he and his wife were left with only one child, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, who was my great-grandmother. They went on to have 2 more boys, and so they had 3 children who survived them. But again, that is a big shock in your life that five of your children should die within a relatively short space of time. He had a hard life, didn't he? So, he probably was a serious-minded person also. I mean, to have that determination to teach yourself to read, to educate yourself, to write the poetry, and to publicize it, and to be your own agent in a way. To do all that is very, very. It's a very strong determination, isn't it?
Skipsey's writing career also highlights some of the difficulties which working class writers have to navigate between the labels of their class and artistic activity, issues which exist just as much for a podcast called Working Class Literature as much as anything else, to be honest.
When Joseph Skipsey wrote his first collection of poetry, he published it as under the pseudonym of J.S., a coal miner. And in the very first review of that text, he was then given the label Pitman Poet. But this idea of the Pitman Poet is both recognition and a trap. So the working class writer, the Pitman Poet in this instance, is trapped within a set of conventions, a set of expectations, and they must write within the community from which they come from, the industry which they belong to. And these are a set of expectations that wouldn't necessarily be placed on a writer from a middle class background or a different class background. In doing so, the working class writer is denied access to the universal range of human emotions, the universal human experience. So, exploring the wide range of human thought, feeling, isn't necessarily available to those who've got the prefix of their industrial label. One Scottish miner who was also a poet and became an MP, James Welsh, noted in the preface to his Songs of a Miner in 1918 that he rather disliked the fact that there was a tendency already in some quarters to dub me a minor poet. Miner I am, poet I may be, but let the world not think there is virtue in the combination. Ploughman poets, navvy poets, minor poets appeal only to the superficialities of life. The poet aims at its elementals. And in the label, it's the elementals that are withdrawn from the working class poet. So even in positive reviews of Skipsey's poems on speculative or imaginative subjects are ignored. Skipsey himself wrote about this to his friend Thomas Dixon, and he said, "None of our reviewers, not even the Athenaeum, have given a critique of the philosophical poems which occupy full 1/2 of the book. That's Miscellaneous Lyrics, published in 1878. So here Skipsey is complaining that even in a review that is heavily weighted in favour of him, the reviewer is unable to recognise poems outside of that narrow definition of what a Pitman poet should write.
However, as Chris explains, issues of class and artistry in many ways are impossible to separate.
I mean, there's also a sort of dilemma between, you don't want to pigeon him as a Pitman poet or a working class writer or whatever, but on the other hand, he is a working class writer. And the fact that as a member of the Victorian working class, he was able to achieve what he did is just tremendously significant and needs to be validated and recognized. So the origins we have to be aware of them. They have to come into the discussion. They have to be part of the equation. The fact that he wrote at all, the fact that somebody could come out of these circumstances that he was born into and succeed in becoming a poet, and a good poet, and a nationally recognized poet. I think it's a testament to his humanity, to his creativity, and to his aspiration. And although the poems stand up for themselves, I think if we read them in that context, we're also becoming aware of the importance of them.
The heartly men are noble, and you'll hear a tale of woe. I'll tell the tale of the heartly men.
That's all we've got time for in this episode. If you want to know more about Joseph Skipsey, you can check out the links in the show notes below. We've also got more info on Skipsey's life, Chris's music, and stories of Thomas Dixon's various shenanigans in the bonus episode, available for patrons now. Patrons also have access to a guide of suggested readings on the rich tradition of miners' literature from the northeast of England. If you enjoyed the show, do consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/workingclassliterature. And if you can't give us any money just now, don't worry, a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app would be much appreciated. That's all for now, and hopefully you'll be hearing from us again soon.